Most of us suck in geography, and honestly, I don't blame you because the real culprit is maps. Yep, the same maps we've been staring at since elementary school have been lying to us. They stretch, distort, and shrink the world in ways that mess with our perception of size, distance, and location. You probably think you have a decent grasp of where things are, but I promise by the end of this, your whole understanding of world geography is going to be shattered. Today, we're diving into 20 absolutely mind-blowing geography facts that expose just how wrong maps make us. And trust me, after this, you'll never look at a world map the same way again. 1. Greenland. Looks as big as Africa, but it's not. Let's start with one of the most absurd misconceptions in geography, and that's Greenland versus Africa. If you look at a standard world map, Greenland appears absolutely massive, almost the same size as Africa. But here's the reality. Africa is actually 14 times larger than Greenland. You could fit Greenland inside Africa over a dozen times and still have space left. But because of the Mercator projection, Greenland, which is located far up near the Arctic Circle, gets stretched out, making it look much bigger than it actually is. Greenland is only about 2.16 million square kilometers, while Africa covers a staggering 30.37 million square kilometers. The difference is enormous, yet most people have no idea because of how maps have been designed for centuries. 2. Europe looks as big as South America, but it's half the size. Now, let's talk about Europe and South America, another classic case of map deception. On most maps, Europe and South America look roughly the same size. Some maps even make it seem like Europe is slightly larger. But once again, this is completely false. South America is actually twice the size of Europe. If you were to take all of Europe and drop it inside South America, it would barely cover half of the continent. And yet, because Europe is located further north, it gets enlarged while South America is compressed. In actual numbers, Europe covers a total area of about 10 million square kilometers, while South America stretches across almost 18 million square kilometers. The difference is massive, yet most people wouldn't realize it just by looking at a traditional map. 3. Canada looks bigger than it really is. Canada is one of the largest countries in the world, but maps make it look even bigger than it actually is. If you look at a world map, it seems like Canada dominates the entire northern hemisphere, stretching endlessly from coast to coast. But in reality, it's not as overwhelmingly massive as it appears. Canada covers around 9.98 million square kilometers, which is undeniably huge, but if you combine the land areas of the United States and China, they are still significantly larger than Canada. Despite this, the Mercator projection inflates Canada's size, making it seem like it takes up an absurd portion of the planet. 4. Mexico City is further north than you think. Most people assume Mexico City is deep in the southern part of North America, much closer to the equator. But here's something that looks completely wrong on a map. Mexico City is actually further north than Miami. That's right. While Miami, Florida feels tropical and warm year-round, Mexico City is located at a higher latitude, 19.43 degrees north, than Miami, 25.76 degrees north. This surprises people because Mexico is often associated with hot, desert-like weather, while Miami is seen as a coastal, tropical paradise. The reason this seems wrong is because of how we mentally group places together. Mexico is south, so we assume it must be further down than any US city. But in reality, parts of Mexico are north of some major US cities, and Mexico City itself sits at a high elevation, making its climate much cooler than you'd expect. 5. Russia. Looks like a supercontinent, but it's smaller than Africa. Russia is the largest country in the world, but if you judge by traditional world maps, you might think it's a supercontinent by itself. The way it stretches across the northern hemisphere makes it look absolutely enormous, dwarfing everything else on the map. But once again, this is just an illusion created by the Mercator projection. Russia covers about 17 million square kilometers, which is undeniably large. But despite how massive it appears, Africa is still bigger. In fact, Africa is almost twice the size of Russia, even though maps make Russia look far larger than it actually is. Because Russia is positioned so far north, its landmass gets stretched out dramatically on Mercator maps. This is why it appears much bigger than it actually is, while Africa, which is near the equator, remains visually compressed. 6. New York is closer to London than it is to Los Angeles. If you look at a flat map, it seems obvious that New York and Los Angeles should be closer to each other than New York and London. After all, they're in the same country. But in reality, London is actually closer to New York than Los Angeles is. The distance from New York to London is about 3,470 miles, while the distance from New York to Los Angeles is roughly 2,450 miles. The reason this seems so surprising is because world maps flatten the curved surface of the Earth, making distances look different than they actually are. In truth, flying across the Atlantic is shorter than flying across the entire United States. 7. Brazil is closer to Africa than it is to most of South America. Brazil is a massive country, and you'd think its closest neighbors would all be in South America. But here's something surprising. Brazil is actually closer to Africa than it is to some other South American countries. The shortest distance across the Atlantic from Brazil to Africa is only about 1,600 miles, while traveling across Brazil itself to places like Ecuador or Peru takes much longer. If you're in northeastern Brazil, you're much closer to Senegal than you are to the western part of your own continent. That's how maps can mess with our perception of distance. 8. Hawaii is not next to the US mainland. It's in the middle of the Pacific. Look at almost any map of the United States and you'll see Hawaii sitting conveniently in a little box near California. This placement makes it seem like the Hawaiian Islands are just off the west coast, but in reality, they are thousands of miles away. Hawaii is actually about 2,400 miles from California. That's nearly the same distance as flying from Los Angeles to New York. The reason maps place Hawaii so close is just for convenience. If they put it where it really belongs, it would be floating alone in the middle of the Pacific, completely disconnected from the rest of the country. 9. Japan looks isolated, but it's closer to Russia and Korea than you think. When people look at a world map, Japan often seems like it's floating all by itself, far from any other country. But in reality, it's much closer to its neighbors than you might think. At its closest point, Japan is only about 43 miles from Russia. You can actually see Russia from some of Japan's northernmost islands. And if you take a ferry from Japan to South Korea, the trip only takes a few hours. Japan might look isolated on maps, but in reality, it's right next to some of the biggest countries in the world. 10. People assume Australia is far from Asia, but it's closer to Indonesia than Sydney is. Most people think of Australia as a remote continent far from the rest of the world. But it's actually much closer to Asia than you might realize. Darwin, in northern Australia, is only about 820 miles from Indonesia. That's a shorter distance than Sydney to Perth, which is over 2,400 miles apart. In other words, it's faster to travel from Australia to Asia than it is to get across Australia itself. Maps make Australia look like it's off on its own, but actually, it's right on Asia's doorstep. 11. Antarctica is again not as big as it looks. One of the biggest victims of map distortion is Antarctica. If you look at a standard world map, it looks like this massive frozen wasteland bigger than all the other continents. But Antarctica is actually the 5th largest continent, not the biggest. Maps stretch it out so much that it looks way larger than it really is. In truth, Antarctica is smaller than both Africa and South America, but because it sits at the bottom of the map, it gets massively distorted. In fact, on some maps, Antarctica looks like it could swallow all of South America whole. But in reality, South America is nearly twice the size of Antarctica. So if you ever thought Antarctica was the biggest continent, thank the maps for lying to you. 12th. Africa can fit the USA, China, and most of Europe inside it. Africa is one of the most underestimated continents on maps. It looks way smaller than it really is, but here's something that will blow your mind. Africa can fit the entire USA, China, and most of Europe inside it. That's how big it is. But maps shrink Africa down, making it seem closer in size to places like Greenland or Russia. In reality, Africa is way bigger than both. If maps showed Africa in its true size, it would be one of the most dominant land masses on the planet. But because it sits along the equator, it gets compressed while northern countries get stretched. This means most people have no idea how enormous Africa actually is. 13. The UK looks huge on maps, but it's smaller than Madagascar. Let's talk about the United Kingdom. If you look at a standard map, the UK seems like a massive island nation, dominating the North Atlantic. It looks bigger than most African countries, and it even seems similar in size to Madagascar. But Madagascar is nearly twice the size of the UK, that's right. Madagascar, which often looks tiny on maps, is actually way bigger than the UK. The reason maps trick us into thinking otherwise is because of how they inflate the size of Europe while shrinking Africa. If you take the UK and overlay it on top of Madagascar, it suddenly looks ridiculously small. But because of bad map projections, we're stuck thinking the UK is much bigger than it actually is. 14. The Pacific Ocean is bigger than all the continents combined. The Pacific Ocean is so vast that it covers more surface area than all the continents combined. Spanning approximately 63 million square miles, it is the largest ocean on Earth, making up nearly 1/3 of the planet's total surface area. However, most world maps don't accurately show its true size. Many maps cut the Pacific in half, placing the Americas on one side and Asia and Australia on the other. This makes it seem like two separate oceans when, in reality, it is one massive, continuous body of water. While the Pacific Ocean's surface area is larger than all the continents combined, it doesn't mean you could physically fit them inside. Instead, if you spread out all the land on Earth, it would still take up less area than the Pacific Ocean alone. 15. Some maps place the USA or Europe in the center, but there's no correct center of the world. If you look at a world map, the United States or Europe is often placed in the center. But there's no actual center of the world. Maps are just designed that way because of tradition. But if you use an Asian-centered map, the world looks completely different. Some maps even put the Pacific Ocean in the middle, which makes North America and Europe look like they're on the edges of the world. This proves that how we see the world is just a matter of perspective. 16. Africa's northern borderlines were drawn randomly by Europeans. If you look at a map of Africa, you'll notice that many of the country borders in the north are perfectly straight lines. That's because they weren't drawn by Africans, they were drawn by Europeans. During the scramble for Africa in the late 1800s, European powers divided up the continent without any regard for ethnic groups, languages, or local cultures. They just drew straight lines on a map and called them borders. That's why today, some African countries have borders that cut right through tribal and ethnic groups, causing conflicts that still exist today. It's one of the most obvious examples of how maps don't always reflect reality. They reflect politics. 17. The USA's border with Canada isn't actually straight. If you've ever looked at a map of the United States and Canada, you've probably noticed the long, straight border along the 49th parallel. It looks like someone just took a ruler and drew a perfect line across North America. But that border isn't actually straight. If you zoom in, the USA-Canada border has tons of small bends and twists. In some places, it follows natural features like rivers and lakes, and in other areas, surveyors just mess up when marking the land. The most ridiculous part is that there are places where the border creates weird little exclaves, tiny parts of one country surrounded by the other. The most famous example is Point Roberts, Washington, a small piece of the US that's completely cut off from the mainland and only accessible through Canada. 18. Argentina and Chile share the longest continuous mountain border. Argentina and Chile share the longest continuous mountain border in the world, stretching over 5,300 kilometers, 3,300 miles, along the Andes Mountains. This natural boundary forms one of the most dramatic borders on Earth. However, while it is the longest mountain border, the longest overall land border belongs to Canada and the United States, which extends 8,891 kilometers, 5,525 miles, across North America. 19. Norway's coastline is longer than the USA's. Norway might look small on a map, especially compared to a massive country like the United States. But because of its thousands of fjords and islands, Norway actually has a longer coastline than the entire mainland USA. Yes, you heard that right. If you stretch out all of Norway's intricate coastline, it adds up to more than 100,000 kilometers, 62,000 miles. The mainland US, by comparison, has a coastline of about 19,900 kilometers, 12,380 miles. This happens because maps make the USA look much bigger than it is, while underestimating Norway's detailed coastline. So while the USA might be massive in land area, when it comes to coastlines, Norway wins. 20. Some world maps still get Australia's shape wrong. Australia is one of the most recognizable countries on a map. But what if I told you that many maps still get its shape completely wrong? Some maps make Australia look skinnier than it actually is, while others squash it down near the equator. In reality, Australia is wider than the continental United States, but maps don't always show it that way. The most common mistake is that some world maps stretch Australia sideways while keeping it shorter than it should be. This makes people think it's a more compact landmass when in reality, it's a massive, sprawling continent. And with this, we come to the end of our video. From size distortions to time zone chaos to straight-up missing countries, maps have been lying to us for centuries, and the saddest part is that most people have no idea. And honestly, that's kind of mind-blowing. What do you think? Let us know in the comments.